and welcome back to The Independent Pianist. I'm your host, Cole Anderson. Today we have the second movement of the Tempest Sonata. This is part 3 of a 3-video series. I had a good deal of difficulty recording this movement, which is, I suppose, ironic, since it isn't fast or loud. It doesn't have any huge technical difficulties in it. Beethoven's slow movements are oftentimes musically so inevitable, so natural and unforced. It feels like we should be able to play them right away with no problem. But for me, the great space and scope of these pieces requires a good deal of time to fully integrate into a completely convincing performance. As I mentioned last week, I had an initial take of this which I thought was successful at the time. While I was playing it, I was just absolutely enjoying myself and having the greatest time. A couple days later, I listened back to it, and I couldn't believe my ears. It sounded like a totally different person. I couldn't recognize my own playing. The tempo was dragged. It didn't make sense. At one point, I even basically misplayed a rhythm because my rubato was so excessive. So that was pretty horrifying, and I had to go back to the drawing board and rethink my approach and re-record. Thankfully, having had this experience, it was fairly easy to get a good take after that. I identify the difficulty with a piece like this being its enormous variety of subdivisions. So you have all possible subdivisions of a 3/4 measure, from a full dotted half note to 32nd notes. So when you have to balance these different elements, finding the right kind of equilibrium between forward motion and repose is very difficult. When you have the long held notes, you have to make sure that you are still sensing forward motion at all times and that you don't allow yourself to bask on the backside of the beat too much. On the other hand, you don't want to shortchange these notes either. There must be an inner rhythmic life that you are sensing in between the notes, an internal subdivision, in fact. This is what creates the cohesion in slow, extended pieces. On the other end of the spectrum, you can't allow the fast notes to run forward too much either, as this would overbalance the music in the other direction. And on top of all that, you can't play too straight or rigid with your tempo. There has to be kind of a subtle give and take. Otherwise, the music takes on a kind of stiff, stultifying effect. So when the music calls for it, you have to be able to change tempo very slightly, and it's very difficult to judge all this and come to a perfect solution. So from the interior musical perspective, if you've followed the previous 2 videos in this series, you know that I'm going to comment on the motivic concision that Beethoven uses to construct this movement. So as I mentioned in the other 2 videos, we have 3 basic motives that are stated at the beginning of the first movement, and they again appear in this movement. In fact, they form the basis of almost everything that we hear. Just to review, those 3 motives are an arpeggio, two-note descending groups, embellishment. Usually it's a turn, but sometimes it can be a trill also. What is also very interesting here is the subtle way in which Beethoven mirrors the intro phrase from the first movement in the first phrase of the second movement. So of course, he starts with the same kind of arpeggio, then there's a completely new variant on the idea of the descending second groups. This might be a little more subtle to see the connection, but if you recall in the first movement, at a certain point Beethoven inverted the descending 2-note group and slowed it down. And what he's doing here is, again, to invert the motive and this time turn it into a dotted rhythm. You'll notice there's also a 3rd note that he adds at the end, but notice how the first 2 notes are very clearly marked to be slurred together. Beethoven shows us what the true musical grouping is, and we should play it in a manner so that that is kind of audible. I don't go as far as to actually make a space in between these notes, but I don't think that would be too excessive if you did want to make a very slight space in between the second and third notes here. At the very least, it should be played in a very clear, articulated kind of way. Then lastly, we get the embellishment motive. And notice how remarkably similar this really sounds to the end of the first phrase in the first movement. So we start out with this very clear example of how Beethoven is constructing the second movement from the first movement. But later on, these motives, while still being used, are abstracted a little bit. So for instance, the idea of the arpeggio, which in the original first movement covers an octave, is abstracted in the second movement into a pure octave drum beat. Besides this kind of abstraction, there are other strange echoes of the first movement, where sections of the first movement are totally transformed in character, but you can really see the outline still there. So notice how similar this passage is from the first movement with this one from the second movement. Of course, the mood is completely changed, but that kind of outline of descending two-note groups is still there. So beyond these motivic considerations, which I've tried to mark in the score as completely as possible, there's a very interesting way in which Beethoven explores musical space in this movement. Now we expect in a slow movement by Beethoven or anyone else among his contemporaries that there will be a lot of space in the sense of time, so long-held chords and rests, for example, and that's definitely the case here. But Beethoven also seems to be experimenting with a kind of vertical space. Vertical in the sense of range, from low to high, so giving the music an impression of great height, as if we were journeying from under the earth to the highest possible vantage point in the sky. He does this by juxtaposing music in a very low register directly against music in a high register. And of course, we see that in the very first phrase. But he also treats later motives in this same way. So that kind of abstracted octave drum beat that I mentioned, he sets it both below and above the melody as the section continues. So that motive also inhabits a very wide vertical space. By the time we get to the end of the piece, Beethoven takes this idea of vertical space to its greatest extreme and combines it with the idea of horizontal space, or space in time, using long notes to create this wonderful sense of stillness. It's an extraordinary passage, quite eerie in its way. It's really remarkable to see on how many levels this piece really functions. Beethoven is trying to make a unique statement with this movement as compared to the other two. Certainly its mood is completely different, but he's still connecting it closely using the motives from the first movement. So I hope you enjoyed this analysis. Stay tuned in a few moments for the complete performance coming up. I will also upload the entire 3-movement sonata soon, so that if you so choose, you can follow all these ideas in my analysis from the first movement to the last. Please do support the channel. Just clicking on the like button and the subscribe button here on YouTube is very helpful, but you can also sign up to become a financial supporter of the channel at www.patreon.com/independentpianist. Even a pledge of a few dollars a month is enormously helpful for me, and I have other methods of contributing to the channel listed in the description box as well. Also, I do teach students online, and I have space in my studio at the moment, so if you're interested in taking your piano playing to the next level and having a teacher who will really push you and challenge you, feel free to drop me a line at cole@independentpianist.com. So thank you again for watching this video, and until next week, take care.